Without further ado, let us jump in. This is in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the story of the Transfiguration is in three of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we're going to look at the account from Mark today. Mark chapter 9, verse 2. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiant, intensely white as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. The Transfiguration, we see this, as I said, in 3 of the 4 Gospels, certainly a mysterious story that takes place about halfway in the middle of Jesus' ministry, you could say. That's why it always comes between Epiphany and Lent. Epiphany often is the first half of his ministry, covered in different ways. Lent is that second half, that journey to the cross. Right, in Luke chapter 9, it tells us Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem, and that is the season that we are about to enter into as a church, journeying towards Jerusalem, therefore towards the crucifixion. And at the halfway point, Jesus has this mysterious experience with a few of his disciples. The story opens up by saying, after 6 days later, and about a week earlier, this is when Jesus had taken his disciples up north, right, up north to the land of the Gentiles. All right, it's called the Decapolis, north of the Sea of Galilee. And this is a pagan territory with the worship of false gods and false idols. In fact, they had seen likely many pagan rituals. And Jesus takes this group of young Jewish men, his disciples, up to see this, and it is astonishing to them. But it's where Jesus decides to make an important lesson, an important point. He asks them, who do people say that I am? And then he asks them more pointedly, who do you say that I am? This is where Peter quite famously would say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, which is Simon, son of Jonah, that's his father's name. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. This is a big moment. Jesus says that the gates of hell will not prevail against this church, and I will build my church on this confession that Christ is Lord. One of the first references of the church from Jesus. And this is a significant moment. Now, a week has gone by. The disciples are likely just chatting all about this little field trip, you could say, that they went on. But now they've gone a little south from where they were, and they've made their way to this high mountain. And Jesus, as he had done several times, pulls away with only a few of them. Not all 12, but only his inner circle, Peter, James, and John. And he takes them, and it says he goes up onto a high mountain. Likely this is Mount Tabor that we see in that area of the region of the Middle East. Mount Tabor is likely the Mount of Transfiguration. He takes them up on the mountain, and then things go crazy. Jesus is up there, and then all of a sudden Jesus, it says, is radiant, that his clothes are brighter than they could ever be bleached by anyone. And then it says that Moses and Elijah show up. And then a cloud appears, and God the Father speaks from within the cloud, saying, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. As it says, the disciples were quite terrified. See, this moment of the Transfiguration, if we really dig in, it's Jesus revealing a bit of his divinity. Jesus, as we confess, is both fully God and fully human. Not half and half. I know that would make more sense in our mathematical minds. Fully God and fully human. And the disciples up until this point had all just kind of seen Jesus as a human. Yes, a pretty cool human who could do some pretty significant things and do miracles and walk on water, but he hadn't yet revealed to them this glimpse of his divinity. And in this moment, they see Jesus for more than just a man, but also for God, whom he is. And they turn away. It's so bright and blinding. Now, Moses and Elijah show up. Maybe you're familiar with Moses and Elijah from the Old Testament scriptures. This is out of place for them. This was not their setting, not their time. They lived many, many, many years earlier in the Old Testament. But Moses and Elijah show up. And what's true about this story, and in fact, I preached this 2 years ago at Transfiguration, and I encourage you to go listen to it if you'd like. Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets, essentially together representing the Old Testament. And they are there together. Peter speaks up to say, hey, let's build a tabernacle. That's the word tent. Let's build a tabernacle for each of the three. And that's when God shows up to say, listen to Jesus. And then the others are gone. So a big part of this story is our understanding that Jesus rises above even the law and the prophets, that story of the Old Testament. It is a story, as we've said many times, leading unto Jesus, not finished, not fulfilled, not final until Jesus. He reveals God. Today I'd love to dig a little further into the story of both Moses and Elijah. Why is it that they appear here on the mountain with Jesus and Peter and James and John? On this Transfiguration Sunday, the title of my message today, as you see behind me, is entitled The Mountain. You know, in the scriptures, the mountains are oftentimes places where people would go to encounter the divine. In fact, that's the story even of the Transfiguration. Both Old and New Testament, they would go and ascend the high mountain, or what they would call a thin place. On earth is down where the humans belong, and up in the heavens is where God belongs, the human space and God's space. And the top of the mountain is, you might call, a thin place where they believed you could encounter God. This is how the ancient mind worked. And all throughout the scripture, you can see this many, many, many times over. This is when people go up on the mountain to encounter God. So today I'd love to look at a few encounters that we have with both Moses and Elijah. And as I said in perspective of our series, we're going to be telling some stories. So is that okay with you today? Let's hear some stories. First, let's start off with Moses. Moses, maybe you're more familiar with Moses than Elijah, but I don't want to assume. Moses is the main character of my favorite movie, The Prince of Egypt. Anyone else? Amen. Fantastic movie. We could just sit and watch that and we'd all be good this morning. Moses, he was born as a Hebrew, as a Jew. But through a terrible scenario where his peers were being killed by the Egyptians, he was put into a basket, put into the Nile River, floated down, and was rescued, pulled out, which is what Moses means, to be pulled out, to be delivered. Pulled out by one in Pharaoh's household. And then Moses would grow up in the household of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the most powerful family in the most powerful nation upon planet Earth at that time. Egypt was the world superpower, the empire above all empires in that day and age. And Moses grows up during that time in the house of Pharaoh, and he has, I want you to imagine, everything that he could ever want. He lives a life of power and privilege. He does not want for anything. He has all that he needs. He has servants at his beck and call. He has all the food and wine that he could enjoy. Moses grows up in a life of privilege in the house of Pharaoh in Egypt. And this goes on for 40 years. 40 years. I feel like I'm currently identifying with Moses. I am 39, but for a few more months. July 11th, where I hit 40, is coming quickly, whether I'm ready or not. And in this, you might say, midlife moment, Moses had a similar one where you start to wonder, how are things going? Am I on the right track? Am I doing the right things? Am I believing the right things? You start to question things. And Moses had a moment where he questioned some things, and he ended up getting into an altercation with an Egyptian and a Hebrew, and Moses killed an Egyptian. And in light of this, Moses had to flee. He left his cushy life in Egypt and he flees out into the wilderness. And Moses has now gone from a place of high privilege to now brought down very, very low. He moves out into the wilderness, to the small town, land of Midian. During this time, he would find a wife and have children. He would begin to essentially just live his life, a life of obscurity. He worked as a shepherd, a humble shepherd who were not in any way at the top of society, but mostly at the bottom. But even as a shepherd, he didn't have his own flocks. No, he was actually shepherding the flocks of his father-in-law. I don't know if anyone has ever had to work for their father-in-law. I worked for my father-in-law before he was my father-in-law, just my girlfriend's dad at the time. It can be a humbling position. And here Moses is, after having all this stuff, has fled into the wilderness and has just settled into obscurity, working as a shepherd, working for his father-in-law, being brought down very humble and very low. And Moses is quite certain of this. This is it. This is how life will end. Nothing more of significance is going to happen in my life. I'm just in the rut of the everyday and the mundane. And maybe today you can in some way identify with Moses where you feel as though, is there anything left exciting, God? Is anything exciting left for me in my life? Or is this it? Moses certainly felt this in this moment. And I don't want us to think about this small season. This period of time goes on for 40 more years. 40 years go by. Moses just working as a shepherd, living in the wilderness, small town, very far removed from the mighty kingdom of Egypt. But at 80 years old, I love this story because Moses is 80 years old, and most people when they're 80 are quite certain that this is near the end and nothing else of significance is going to happen. But for the story of Moses, you and I would have never heard of Moses had his story not just begun when he turned 80 years old. Moses, as he is out shepherding, goes to the mountain. As we said, we're going to talk about some mountains today. He goes just outside of Mount Sinai. Maybe you've heard of Mount Sinai before. It's quite prominent in the Old Testament. In fact, I want you to see a few pictures. Jessalyn and I got to visit Mount Sinai 2010. Here we are, 2010 version of us. The picture's a little faded out. Here's us there. The next one is another view from the mountain. This is up at the top of Mount Sinai. And we took this next one right at sunrise. We got to experience, we rode up on the backs of camels in the middle of the night in the pitch black dark and made it to the top of Mount Sinai to see the sunrise. A life-changing experience. And I pray I get to go back one day. This is Mount Sinai for those of you that don't have a reference that want to understand what it looks like. But Moses makes his way to Mount Sinai, and there he turns his head aside and he sees something quite significant. There is a bush that is burning, but it is not burning up. This is the story of the burning bush. The bush should be burning up and turning black and turning to ash, and yet it is green and vibrant and alive, though it is on fire. It is not consumed by the fire. And Moses then hears a booming voice from within the fire that says, "Take off your sandals, you are on holy ground." Moses has an encounter with God. An encounter unlike anything he had experienced before. And in this moment, this rushes Moses into a major purpose of his life, and he would then be sent into Egypt. This is actually where all the action takes place, but we're going to zoom through it really quickly. He's sent into Egypt. He comes and talks with Pharaoh. God would end up intervening with the 10 plagues, and after the Passover, finally Pharaoh agrees to let the people go, to let the Hebrews go out of their slavery. And they're freed and they leave and they come out into the wilderness, make their way to the Red Sea. God miraculously parts the Red Sea. The Egyptian army bears down on them, but God protects them. They pass through the Red Sea on dry land. It closes up behind them, and then here they are. God's people that are free, really for the first time. And Moses, in this moment, makes a decision that he is going to take them back to the mountain. He goes back to the very same mountain where he had encountered God in the burning bush, back to Mount Sinai. And Moses would have an interesting encounter with God. This is where I want us to read today from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 24, verses 15 through 18. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. You remember the cloud? Remember the cloud? The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Moses returns to the scene where he had encountered God at the burning bush and is then beckoned, called up the mountain to the top of Mount Sinai, maybe even just where we were some 15 years ago. And there on the top of Mount Sinai, it says that God's presence dwelt, hovered like a cloud. His weightiness is what His glory oftentimes means. His weightiness, His glory, His presence is there in the form of a cloud. And for 6 days, this cloud is there. And then on the seventh day, the cloud calls out to him, God from in the midst of the cloud, and He invites Moses in. Now, the shocking thing is that Moses is seeing a cloud, but it tells us that all the people down below, as they look up on the mountain, what are they seeing? A fire, a devouring fire. Their perspective is the fire, and yet Moses' perspective is the cloud. And so Moses enters into the cloud, enters into the fire, and everyone down below is certain that, well, Moses is gone. Moses must have died. He walked right into that fire. I love that Moses goes into the presence of God here. It says he spends 40 days and 40 nights in the presence of God. I don't know if he eats or drinks or if he's just sustained by the very presence of God, but he is there with God, communing with Him 40 days and 40 nights in the midst of the cloud, in the midst of the fire. You see, Moses had encountered God first at a burning bush that was on fire, but yet not consumed. And what I love about this is now Moses has entered into the fire and yet is not consumed. He has himself become the very burning bush where he has encountered God. See, God's consuming fire beckons us in. We've spoken of this before. Sometimes I know we want to pull back and hide and run from the consuming fire of God, but we understand that it is meant to consume all of us that is not who we are meant to be and burn away the imperfections and impurities. God is a consuming yet cleansing and refining fire. It's a beautiful image. Burning away the imperfections, leaving us with who we are meant and intended to be in God's sight. And God calls us, just like He called Moses, into the fire. The story continues. Moses would revisit this mountain several times, by the way. The people of Israel would wander the wilderness for 40 years, quite famously for 40 years due to their disobedience. And as they wander, Moses would eventually make his way back around to the mountain again. And I want us to see one more encounter that Moses has with God. Exodus now, chapter 33. Some time has gone by. Verse 18. Moses said to God, "Please show me your glory." And He said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, Yahweh. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But He said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand in the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." A rather peculiar story here. Moses once again encountering God on the mountain. And this time he says, I feel like he works it up. God, let me see your glory. He's begun to develop a relationship with God. God, let me see your glory. Show me your glory, God. And I absolutely love what God says. I don't want us to miss it. He says, yes, I will allow my goodness to pass before you. Moses asked for the glory of God, and he says, yes, I will show you my goodness. The glory of God is His goodness, according to God. Sometimes we're convinced that the glory of God is about His power or might or ability to instill fear or awe or strength, and all those things work their way and can connect us to God in some way. But God says, my glory is my goodness. And what's even more beautiful, He gives Him His name, Yahweh, which we've talked about before. Yahweh means I am that I am, or I am that I will be, or I will be that I am. It's a beautiful meaning that says, what I am, I will stay as. I will not change and morph. This is a theological term meaning the immutability of God. He does not mutate and change. He is good and gracious and kind and merciful yesterday, today, and forever. Amen. And he tells Moses here, I am Yahweh, I will be what I am. And there was no fear to have of God where he's going to change into something mean or terrible later. God will remain who he is. And he says, I am good. Maybe you need to hear the message today that God is good. So many of us have forgotten that God is good. His glory is his goodness. And then it's interesting what takes place. He tells Moses, okay, I'm going to place you in the cleft of a rock, kind of a cutout, cave-like thing of a rock. And then I'm going to pass by, but as I do, I'm going to cover you up with my hand and pass by. And then once I've passed by, I will remove my hand so that you can see my back. For you shall not see my face, God says. So Moses encounters God, his back. I believe the Old Testament is a story of many people who have seen God's back. Not yet fully understand who God is. They know and meet him and understand him to an extent, but not fully. It's a story leading unto Jesus. Moses and many others would see and experience God, but just his back. Moses would not see his face. Elijah. Did we forget there's another? Elijah. Elijah is also on the mountain with Jesus and Peter and James and John. Elijah, maybe you're less familiar with. He is a prominent prophet, yet he doesn't have a book named after him in our Bible, as Isaiah and Jeremiah and these others do. But Elijah's story is mainly told in 1 Kings. And Elijah, as most all of the prophets, come at a tumultuous time in Israel's story. So many years have gone by now since Moses. The people have wandered through the wilderness and made their way to the promised land, and they had a series of judges that helped rule, and then finally they got their king and their monarchy, and they had King Saul, and then King David, and then King Solomon, and then, as we've talked about many times, the nation splits. God's people that were supposed to be unified, displaying God to the world, can't get along amongst themselves, and they split the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And it's during this period of time while they are split when God sends the majority of the Hebrew prophets that we read about in the Old Testament to bring a word from God to the people, to remind them of who God is, to remind them of what God has called them to be. And during this time of the divided kingdom, there are many kings, some of whom are good, most of whom are not. Some of whom are even evil. And you might say that this king that's in place when Elijah is the prophet is even evil. There's a king by the name of Ahab. King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Sometimes you may have even heard of that name Jezebel before. It's not something you really want to name your kid necessarily. Though you could. Jesslyn hates it when we call her Jezebel. It's a fun thing to do if you ever really get to know her. You can call her Jezebel. Jezebel was a wicked woman, as the story is told in the New Testament. And by the way, I just thought of this. If you have a friend named Jezebel, I love them. Invite them to church. Don't tell them what I just said. But in this story, Jezebel is an evil woman, just like her husband, King Ahab. So you imagine the direction of the people as they're led by these wicked rulers. And one of the things that Jezebel has brought about is this worship of now a foreign god. No longer Yahweh, but this god Baal, pronounced Baal. But we're going to say Baal for today to work through it a little easier. She brings in this false god, this Canaanite god, this foreign god, Baal, and she begins to work that into the psyche of the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Judahites. And many turn and begin to worship this false god, Baal. It's a dark time in the story. Elijah is the lone prophet of Yahweh. He is the prophet. Baal, on the other hand, it tells us, has 450 state-sponsored prophets. By all accounts, it certainly appears as though Yahweh is losing the battle. And Elijah's most famous, perhaps his most well-known story, comes in this epic showdown between Yahweh and Baal. And there's a showdown between he, the prophet, and the 450 prophets of Baal, where they're going to call down from their God to bring fire from heaven to consume the altar and burn up the sacrifice. And the 450 prophets of Baal go first, and they call to Baal, and they call out to him, and they sing their songs, and they cut themselves, and they chant things, and they dance, and they do all that they can do to get and summon Baal to respond with fire, and nothing happens. Baal does not respond. And Elijah says, I'll take a turn. And Elijah summons and calls God and asks Yahweh to bring fire from heaven. And God responds with a fireball from heaven that comes down, burns up the altar, burns up the offering. God has proven himself victorious. 1 verse 450, but it's really God versus anything else. God has come out victorious. And Elijah is this, imagine this hero, the winner. Now the ending of this story is less well known. Elijah would go on in that moment to kill all 450 of those prophets. That's where we read the Bible and it's like, oh, I like that story, but what about that part? Elijah kills all 450 of the prophets of Baal by the sword. And in fact, this is the moment where really our story of Elijah picks up. After he kills all of the prophets of Baal, after this great victory in this showdown between God and Baal, between Yahweh and Baal, Elijah is victorious, and then he wanders off and he falls into a depression. He has some sort of mental, emotional breakdown. It says it this way, 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4. But he, Elijah, himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Elijah has just experienced a great victory. And yet now he wanders into the wilderness and he finds this lone broom tree. Moses had a bush, a burning bush, and Elijah has a lone broom tree. You might even call it a bush, not a mighty cedar or an oak, little broom tree. And Elijah feels like this lone broom tree and that he himself is also alone. There's no one left. It's just him. And he lays down and he says, I just want to die. Imagine the lowest point that you could be. Maybe you've felt those feelings before. Maybe you have a loved one that you know have felt those feelings before. Elijah just wanted it all to end. He just wanted God to come and take his life away, and he prays this. Maybe you've even prayed this before. God, I have no more purpose. There's nothing in front of me. I've got nothing to do. I'm all alone. I don't see it getting better. Just take my life away. Elijah drops all the way down to this place. But the story's not over. The story's far from over. In fact, God sends an angel. Let's pick up the story, verse 5, the very next verse, verse number 5. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones in a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for you, Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. Elijah is curled up underneath a lone broom tree in the wilderness, wishing that he would die, and the Lord sends him an angel. I love angels in the Bible. This angel isn't given a name. We don't know who this angel is, but I love when angels appear. Did you know that even in the New Testament, Jesus at least 2 times receives an angel to minister to him? Jesus, fully God and yet fully human, Jesus there, when he's tempted by the Satan in the wilderness, is afterwards receives an angel. Angels come and minister to him. And again, when he's praying, sweating drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, afterwards an angel comes and ministers to him. And in this moment, Elijah, at his lowest low point of his life, wanting to die and things to end, an angel comes to him and ministers to him. It says he brings him hot cakes, food and water, and he rests. Sometimes I've heard people describe this verse and say, you know what, sometimes you just need a snack and a nap. And the angel brings a snack and a nap to Elijah. And then Elijah arises and is sent now on this mission to encounter God. And it says he goes in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Now, if we could pause the story here for a moment. There are many differences between the story of Moses and Elijah, and yet there are also some similarities that I don't want us to miss over. Moses, when he goes into the fire of God, the cloud of God to encounter him, he's there for 40 days and 40 nights. Do we remember? 40 days and 40 nights. And now Elijah is strengthened in the Lord in this food. He goes on this quest, this journey to encounter God, and the quest is what? 40 days and 40 nights. It says he goes to Horeb, the Mount of God. Did you know another name for Mount Horeb is Mount Sinai? Elijah, in fact, goes to the very same place that Moses had been many years earlier. Moses himself seeking to know and encounter God in some miraculous way and having but a glimpse of God. And now Elijah, who has been following and loving and serving God, is wanting a glimpse of him once again. He goes on this quest 40 days and 40 nights and makes his way to the very same mountain to encounter God. And God speaks up. What does God say? He asks him a question. He says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah responds to say, I'm all alone, but also I'm jealous for you, God. You caught that when he said that a minute ago. We read that. I am jealous for you. That Hebrew root word for jealous is qana. You want to say that together? That's a fun one. On three. 1, 2, 3. Qana. Q-A-N-A. Transliterated. Qana. It's the word that we have there for jealous. Most often of the times, it's translated not as jealous, but as zealous. Jealous with a Z. I am zealous for you, God. I have extreme devotion and envy. I am zealous for you, God. I have zeal for you, God. We've spoken of zeal a time or two here at the church. Zeal is used often in the scriptures. And to be zealous is oftentimes associated with spiritual or religious violence in the Bible. Several examples. King Jehu, who you may have heard of, you may not have, but he's a king. King Jehu, it says, was zealous for God, and he killed many people. Phinehas was said to be zealous for God, and he also killed many people. Elijah, we're told, was zealous for God, and he has just killed many people, the 450 prophets of Baal. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who we first meet as Saul of Tarsus, says he was zealous for God, and he persecuted the church unto prison and even some unto death. All of these things are done in the name of God. And Elijah says, I am zealous for you. You know, similar to Moses, Elijah has yet to have a full picture of God. It's incomplete. He hasn't yet fully understood what God is like and what God would require of him. But he's quite confident in his zeal for God. In this moment, they have an encounter. God speaks. Both Moses and Elijah have a glimpse of God. And then the story comes to a conclusion. I want to read these next 3 verses, verse 11 through 13. And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah is seeking to encounter God. He wants to know and experience God. He's been devoted with extreme zeal to God, but he wants to fully understand Him, and now he's on this quest and is meeting with God upon the mountain. He tells God he is zealous for Him, and God asks these questions of him, and then God says, "I'm going to pass by you." Does this language sound familiar again? Moses had been in the cleft of the rock as God passed by, and now Elijah on the same mountain is placed in the cave of the rock, essentially the very same thing, the cleft of the rock, and God will pass by him. And Elijah is certain of God's power and might, and so then God is going to come by first. It's this great mighty rushing wind, so strong as to break rocks in half. And Elijah peers in, and God is not in the wind. And then an earthquake, a strong and powerful earthquake shaking the foundations of the earth. And Elijah peers into the earthquake, and the earthquake is empty. God is not in the earthquake. And then a fire. Moses had encountered God in the fire. Perhaps Elijah will encounter God in the fire. But no, that's not what Elijah needed in this moment. God speaks to us in ways in which we need to hear God, by the way. He loves you that much to do so. And the fire comes and it consumes and burns up, and he looks in and there's no God in the fire. And then it is just silent. And Elijah leans in. He hears a whisper, the faint sound of a whisper, and he leans in to hear, and God is asking him a question. In fact, I love it because God is asking him the very same question he just asked him. He says, "What are you doing here? Do I have your attention yet, Elijah? Elijah, what are you doing here?" You know that when God asks us questions, it's not because He does not know the answer. When God asks us of us questions, He is trying to beckon us, call us, make us aware of where we are. That's what God is doing when He asks questions. Bring an awareness to us of where we are and what we need to do, and perhaps what a next step is that we need to take to open up our eyes to see. Jesus would always say, "Let him who has ears hear and who has eyes see." This is the understanding of God as He asks us questions, is to invite us in to fully consider where we are and what we need. And Elijah responds again saying, "I'm zealous for you, Lord, and also I'm alone. I'm by myself." You know, sometimes we encounter God in the fire, sometime in the whisper, and sometime in a friend. Have you ever encountered God in a friend? I know I have. A friend that was there at just the right time. God puts us into friendships and relationships and community. That is the church, by the way, to be the very presence of God in our lives in these moments. And what Elijah was feeling is that he was alone. This is what led him into his very depression, where he wanted to end his own life. He felt as though nobody was with him. "I'm only by myself. Lord, it's just me and you and nobody else." And that was not good enough for Elijah. He needed a friend, and God agreed. You do need a friend. In fact, the very end of this story, as it plays out in the book of 1 Kings, God sends Elijah back into town. He sends him to anoint King Jehu. He sends him to anoint his successor, Elisha, the prophet who would become his great friend and the one who works with him and would eventually replace him, Elisha. And then he reminds him that there are 7,000 people yet still in Israel that worship Yahweh. Elijah was certain he was alone, the last one left. Everyone else had turned aside to worship the false god of Baal. And God says, "Hey, listen, you may not be aware, but there are 7,000 yet still in Israel worshiping my name. Take heart." Elijah needed a friend to encounter God with community. And God would send that community to him and open his eyes to become aware that it in fact was already there. Sometimes your community is already there, but you've sort of turned your back to it, denying its presence. And you need to welcome it in. So let's come all the way back to Mount Tabor, the mountain with Jesus and Peter and James and John. And they're there and they're terrified, but they're excited and they see the presence of God and they're just glad to be there. They love that they're there. And then Moses and Elijah show up and they're talking to Jesus. And I love this because I bet that Moses and Elijah are just as excited to be there as Peter and James and John. They appear, how does this happen? I don't know. They appear on this mountain with Jesus as he's transfigured, and the divinity of God is shining through him. He's showing a glimpse of his God-like status. He is God, and it's shining through. And now Moses, who so long ago had desired to see God but could only see the back of God, is now able finally to see the face of God. And he sees it in Jesus. Moses, who had so longed to see the face of God and yet was not able to in his own time, and now he is brought back and appears before God in the form of Jesus and talks to him face to face. And Elijah, who had longed for a friend, who had longed to not be alone, now meets the very one and true friend in Jesus. And what would establish the coming of the church, the community of faith that now exists around the world, welcoming and inviting people in who may feel as though they are alone and by themselves and have no one with them. The church becoming that very presence in the world. And Elijah, who understood what he thought devotion was to God was all about, the ability and capacity to be violent on behalf of God. And now he sees Jesus and learns, of course, that true devotion to God is not in our capacity to be violent and angry, but in our ability to be loving and forgiving. Moses and Elijah, their stories, who were yet incomplete, find this completion on Mount Tabor, on the Transfiguration moment with Jesus. In fact, all of the Old Testament finds its completion in Jesus. In fact, all of our stories find their completion in Jesus. Today we've heard the story of Moses and Elijah leading up to this moment where they encounter Jesus and see God for the first time in a new way. We all here today, we all have a story. A long series of events of good decisions and bad decisions, of places we've lived and relationships we've been in, and all sorts of things in between. We all have a story that's led us on a journey, and I prayed that on your story, on your journey, that you would have an encounter with Jesus, that you would understand that He is the one who reveals who God is. As you seek to understand the divine and greater things than can we fathom in our minds, that you would see Jesus as the one who explains these things. To know Him is to know God. And Jesus displays the loving mercy of God that is given to each of us. And I pray that you would reach out and take it. I pray that Jesus would bring a new meaning and purpose into your life. That you would follow headlong after Jesus to follow His path He's laid out for you. That you would live in the world that is so counter to the kingdom of God, but you would stay faithful to follow the footsteps of Jesus. Even when others seek to pull you away, that you would remain faithful to the path that Jesus has called you. That you would love your enemies, that you would forgive those who have wronged you. That you would live a life of generosity, that you would show mercy and kindness. That you would display Jesus to the world around you. So that when they see you, they see a glimpse of God. Amen? Happy Transfiguration Sunday to you today.